Hello, in this video we'll be looking at setting up markers to map out our project and adjusting the tempo using these markers. We will also be highlighting certain points in the film where we might like to add sounds. In this example we'll be looking at an explosion and pushing some buttons, and then we will import some sounds that we can use to link up with the movement on the screen. So referring back to our film scoring cue sheet, you should by now have some idea of what's going on in the film. Perhaps some musical ideas or sounds that you can hear that you want to use. So if we go back to our project, having watched the film through, there are at least two big changes in terms of tempo. During the intro section, there is a slower paced tempo as the astronauts are dealing with a potential issue and there is concern, but nothing drastic has happened at this point. About a minute in, there is an explosion, there is a moment of uncertainty, and then Matthew McConaughey here decides that he's going to race against time and get his ship to the space station that's just exploded. At this point, the pace of the film is going to ramp up, so we may want to change the tempo at this point. Now, in order to work out what kind of tempo we want to use, we can use a tool called Tap Tempo. There is one built in Logic, but I find it's actually quicker to use the one on Google. So if you type Tap Tempo into Google and go to the first link, 8.com, all you have to do is tap on the spacebar continuously and it will provide you with an approximate tempo. So what we're going to do is we're going to play the film and try and get a feel for what tempo we think the film is at. Okay, so you may feel a different tempo when you're tapping. When I was watching this, I was imagining a clock ticking, as there seems to be some time issue, or we're just waiting for something to happen. So in my head, I was hearing a clock ticking along, and the tempo I tapped at was actually 60 beats per minute, which would be the movement of a clock every second. So I want to make sure that this is at 60 BPM at the beginning. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to mark down using my marker track that I want this section to be at 60 BPM. Put the cursor at the very beginning, hit the plus symbol, and it will create a marker for me. You can rename the markers by double clicking. I'm going to type in tempo 60 BPM. Now the next big change in tempo that I want to go to is where the explosion happens. I can imagine that time kind of stops at this point, so I'm not sure if there's going to be too much musically going on during these few seconds. So I'm going to move forward, so when Matthew McConaughey decides to ramp up the engines and start moving towards the spaceship. You may have to zoom in to get the timing right on this. I think it's about here. If you look at his face, this is about the point that he decides, right, I'm going to race towards the space station. Okay, so I want to add a marker here, so I'm going to hit the plus symbol. Now let's see if I can work out a tempo for this section. Okay, so that's slightly faster. We're looking at maybe around 90 BPM there. We can change this later on. This is just a work in progress, so this is sort of, I'm just trying to feel the pace of the movie at this point, but we can always make adjustments later on. We're just trying to map out the start of our film. So, at this stage here, I want to make the tempo around 90 BPM. I'm going to rename this marker to state that I want the tempo to change to 90 BPM. Before we can make any changes to our tempo, we need to lock these markers to the SMPTE timecode. SMPTE is the timecode format that is used for videos. So we want to make sure that whatever point the film is at, those markers are also locked there. If we start making changes to the tempo without locking the markers to SMPTE, the markers will move whenever we change that tempo, which defeats the point of having them locked on to the film. To do this, we go up to the top right hand corner and click on the menu list editor here, and we select marker. We also want to change our view to show the event position and the length as time, not as bar positions. When we change this, we'll see that we are looking at a SMPTE timecode. To lock these into position, we click on the blank space here under the L. We can now see there's a lock on these markers, so when we change the tempo of Logic, or of the project in Logic, the markers will not move out of position. We can close this now. So we know that at the very beginning we want the tempo to be 60 BPM. If we go over to our tempo global track, we will see a blue line. This represents the tempo at any point in time. We can move the line up and down, and we can add additional nodes and change the tempo throughout the project. I'm just going to hit Command Z a few times and undo all that. So we know that at the very beginning we want the tempo to be 60 BPM. I'm going to click on the node at the beginning and drag it all the way down. And if you look at the little dialog window next to the cursor, you will see the change tempo amount is now 60. So we will now move our cursor along to the second marker. We will click to create a node, and I want this to be 90 BPM, so I'll move this up until we get to 90. I've turned on the metronome here, so when I play the video, we will hear the metronome clicking along and get a sense of change in the tempo. So at the beginning of the scene, working at 60 BPM. After the explosion takes place and Matthew McConaughey decides to race to the space station, we should hear a sudden jump in tempo. There we go. You can be more detailed and micro-tune the changes to the tempo and the markers as you go through your project. For now, we're just trying to get a broad overview, so I'm not going to go into too much detail at this point, but this is just the technique that you would use to make those tempo changes. The last thing we want to do is add some additional markers to identify potential hit points. So these could be things that happen on the screen that we might want to have a sound for. So let's go back to the beginning. I will zoom in slightly. As we hit play, there might be some dialogue here. There's the movement of these latches. And at this point, Matt Damon is going to push a button. So these are all noises that we might want to apply sound to. You could argue that the latches are moving in space, therefore you wouldn't hear them. But for the purposes of this demonstration, I will create some sounds for it. Okay, so let's create some markers to identify these hit points. So let's move our cursor to where the latch appears. Here we go. Great. I'm going to hit the plus symbol and add a marker. And type in latch movement. I'm going to zoom out so I can move quicker through the video. Now let's find where he pushes the button. So it's right about here. If we zoom in again, we can be a bit more precise. Okay, plus symbol, button push. And the third one that I will do for this demonstration is the explosion. So let's go way over here. Okay, so there are going to be a series of sounds at this point. There's the suction sound as the astronaut gets pulled out of the airlock. and there's the air being sort of sprayed around the place. There's this part of the ship detaching, but the bit that I'm going to lock onto is right here where this explosion takes place. So let's lock that onto point there. So plus symbol, and I'll type in explosion. And now we can zoom out. Don't forget that we want to make sure that the markers are locked to the SMPTE timecode. So I'm going to go back to my editor list and make sure that each of my markers here has been locked so that nothing will move when we change any tempos at a later date. We will be designing our own sounds as part of the project, but to get us started you might want to find some pre-made samples just to start putting things into position and getting a picture of where we are. So on OneNote there are two links. There's one to a folder of various sound effects and impacts and hits, and there's another link to a website called Freesound. Freesound is a collaborative website in which people can upload their own sounds and samples and recordings. You are able to register and download everything for free, and the samples are also royalty free. So this is a really good resource for finding sounds to put into your project. I have already selected 4 sounds which I've also added to OneNote to get you started. These are the ones that I will use for this demonstration, but feel free to go back to Freesound and browse the thousands of samples that they have on there that you might be able to use. So I'm going to go to my Finder window and find the explosion sound. Let's just test this one out. Okay, that's the sound I want. All you have to do is drag that file into Logic and it will appear on an audio track. So now we're going to line up the cursor with the beginning of this explosion sound. So if we wind it back a bit and hit play, okay, that's roughly in sync. That's good enough to get us started for the moment. I'm also going to go back to the beginning and look at the latch sounds. Okay, so this is where the latches are moving. Now I have a latch sound. This is the sound I want to use, so I'm going to drag and drop this onto a new audio track in Logic and start to line up the sound with the cursor. The volume of this audio clip is very low, so I'm going to drag out the track so I can see a bit more clearly where the actual sound occurs. So let's move this one here. I'm going to turn off the metronome. Let's try that again. Now I like that second sound, but it lasts slightly too long, so I'm going to put on my scissors tool and cut that bit out. Let's listen to the last sound. Slightly better. Now the latches move 3 times in this cut, so I'm going to start off with the first sound from this recording, use the second sound for a bit of variation, and then return back to the first sound again. So let's shorten this clip. That's a little bit too early. Let's find the second sound. So this is the latch moving one way. This will be the latch moving back again. That's too early. Let's see if we can catch that moment that it moves back. In, out, about there. Okay. And then I'm going to hold down the Option button on the keyboard and click and drag, and that will duplicate this audio track. And let's line up the movement of the latch back again. It starts about here. Okay, so that's roughly where we want to be. We can fine tune this again later on. And the last thing I'm going to do is line up this button push. Now, this is where we start to get into a concept called layering. Layering is when you use more than one sample that will play at the same time to create a more textured sound. As Matt Damon pushes the button, I imagine that there's the sound of a click, but there might also be a beep as well. So I'm going to add 2 samples to this section. Perfect. And let's see if I can find my click sound. That'll do. Okay, so let's find the exact point that he pushes the button. It's about there. So I'm going to move both these sounds onto the cursor. I can see here, if I open up this track, that this is the point that the audio starts with the click. Okay, the beep is too loud for my liking. I'm going to turn this down. We're getting there. It's getting a bit closer to being synchronized to the movement. I'm going to turn that down even more. Okay, that'll do for the moment. Now, we can replace all these sounds later on. The idea is to start putting together a picture of what's going on with the movie and get some kind of idea of the soundscape that these characters are living in. So what I would like